Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 131 of Experience Data Talk podcast and video show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. My name is Mike Delgado. Today, we're honored to chat with David Kopec, a professor of computer science and innovation at Champlain College and the author of a series of computer science books on Python, Dart, Swift, and Java. In today's show, David talks with us about his academic background, earning his undergraduate degree in economics and a minor in English literature, and then going on to earn his Master's of Science degree in computer science at Dartmouth College. He shares advice for those wanting to get into a computer science graduate school program and how to stand out in applications. He also talks with us about teaching computer science classes and provides advice for those of us who want to improve our teaching methods and also build class engagement. He also gives some encouragement and advice for those computer science grads who just finished up their schooling and are looking for their first jobs amid COVID-19. David then talks about how he's had to adjust and pivot his own teaching style, having to move online, and talks about his experiences testing out different types of teaching formats and what method has been most meaningful to students and also what has also built more engagement. At the end of the show, David talks with us about his latest book, called Classic Computer Science Problems in Python. We talk about this and so much more. Here's our conversation. All right. Well, David, welcome to Data Talk.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael. I'm really excited to be here.
So I want to talk with you about your background because you have a very fascinating background. I was looking on LinkedIn and I saw that you actually did your undergraduate work in econ and actually got a minor in English lit. And I would love to know a little bit about that, like your initial undergrad program, and then what led you into computer science after that?
So I'd always had an interest in computer science. I'd been programming since I was a young kid, like 8 years old. But I thought maybe my path would be that I'd go into the technology business, like kind of on the business side. So I did my undergrad in economics. And coming out of that, I was graduating during the Great Recession. And I basically took the first job offer that I got when it was the fall of my senior year. The fall of my senior year was 2008, and I was doing corporate recruiting, and nobody was getting jobs. And somebody at a healthcare consulting company liked me, and I got an offer, and so I took the first one I got, and it wasn't something I was really interested in. And I went and did it, and I have to say I really didn't like it when I was doing it. So as I was doing it, I started thinking, okay, I better go back to grad school and take a different path. And so I ended up doing a master's in computer science. And then I went and worked in the startup world. I did a couple startups. None of them were successful. And I ended up starting building iOS apps for other people as kind of a consultant. And while I was doing that, I got an adjunct teaching gig at a local college in New York. And it was going really well, actually. And I'd also written my first book called Dart for Absolute Beginners. So I'd kind of started dipping my toes into computer science education. And then up here in Vermont, just on a whim kind of, I applied to a job to be a full-time teaching professor, teaching computer science with an emphasis on mobile app development because they have a mobile app development specialization where I work and they needed somebody for that. And so combining my background in iOS development with doing some work in computer science education, the stars just kind of aligned and it was the perfect opportunity for me.
That's awesome. Before we move forward, you mentioned something about graduating during a recession. And it's super hard when you're just entering the job market and you're just getting out of school. So you don't have a lot of corporate experience. You just have the academic experience and skill set, which is huge. But it's really hard in a recession because you're competing now with people who just lost their jobs with maybe 10 years more experience than you do. And I feel like that's what's happening right now during COVID. We have all these new grads who are ready to launch their career. And now we have COVID-19. We have hiring freezes across the nation, around the world, basically. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give those people who are just trying to get started, maybe feeling like you felt just entering into recession, like lucky to get a job? What advice do you have for those that right now they're feeling that right now?
Well, I do think I got a little bit lucky, so I don't want to make too much of it, but I think I did lower my standards. And I think being willing to take a job that's not necessarily the path that you want, but just that you have something on your resume, something that you're doing that's productive. Even if I would think today, even, in computer science, that might even be that you're doing open source work while you're looking for a job. or that you're doing some kind of volunteer work and contributing to teaching computer science to people in underprivileged communities, anything like that, where you're just having something that you're doing during that time, even if it's not the thing that you really want to be doing, your dream that you want to be doing, I think is valuable. So even though that was not a job that I wanted, it was good that I wasn't doing nothing during the recession. So just latching on to whatever you can to get some professional experience.
How soon after taking that first job did you realize that this is probably not something I want to stick with?
Almost right away. So the
Mm,
job was in pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceutical drugs. And so it was a pharmaceutical company has a new drug coming out. What should the price of that drug be? And the way you'd
mm,
go about doing that was you'd call up people who are responsible for purchasing them for hospitals or for insurance plans, and you would kind of interview them and say, well, how much do you think this drug should cost? It wasn't the most data driven process that you could imagine, but there was also many ethical dilemmas about that, as you might
mm.
imagine. And so I did it for less than a year. I got out of there as quickly as I could to go to grad school. It was it really the ethical issues with it really weighed on me. And I don't think it would be something I would ever choose to do.
Mm. Well, that raises a good point because sometimes we might find ourselves in a role or a job where we never expected to be in an ethical dilemma or something that we feel is compromising our personal ethics. And that can be a very difficult time because sometimes you're trying to pay the bills, sometimes you're just trying to get food on the table, and you're working in a job that now you feel uncomfortable doing. What advice do you have for those who maybe felt like that, feeling a bit frustrated? They got into a job and now they're in a situation where they're feeling like they're making some personal compromises and they want to just get out.
It's hard for me to answer that because I was in a privileged position that I could go to grad school and get out. So it's not
Yep.
like I had no other alternatives in my life. But I mean, I would say you have to feel good about yourself at the end of the day. And so if you have any option to get out of something that you don't feel ethically right about doing, I think you should take it because I think it's much more important to be able to look yourself in the mirror the next morning than it is to have some paycheck.
When you decided to go back to graduate school and moving into a master's degree in computer science, you had the undergraduate work in econ, so you had all the math, the stats, and you also had a minor in English lit. But sometimes some schools like, oh, before you can jump into computer science, you need to take these extra classes. Was it hard to pivot? Did they require you to take extra classes before you get into that program?
Yeah, they did. So there was a challenge to get all of the prerequisite knowledge to be able to enter a graduate level program. And I had taken 5 computer science classes as an undergraduate, so it wasn't like I had no formal background. But I did need to take, I think, 3, and I think they only even required me to audit them over the summer, but at least
Mm,
to have enough of a background that I would come in being able to take what were considered graduate level classes. And they let me take even some undergraduate classes while I was doing the master's to build up my knowledge as I was going as well in some areas that I was lacking. So I really appreciate how flexible they were about that. And my understanding is that most programs, if you have a strong candidate, somebody that you feel that you're willing to accept, will be willing to make that sort of compromise and let you do a little bit of undergraduate work to get up to the level that you need to be. I think they're looking more for strong candidates than they are looking for somebody that checks every single box on some checklist. I think most graduate programs are like that. But yeah, there's certainly a challenge transitioning from a totally different undergraduate field to a technical graduate field, certainly. And I think you do need to do the work to make sure you're at a level appropriate for the transition.
it's awesome that you already had like 5 computer science classes even going in, which definitely made you a stronger candidate. For those that are just applying for graduate school in a technical field like computer science, what would be some advice you'd give them to help them stand out so they can get accepted?
I think there's a lot of things you can do on your own today that weren't as possible decades ago. One of them is you can contribute to open source and you can then show those contributions somehow in your application, perhaps in the letter that you write, perhaps somewhere on your resume. I think you can write apps on your own nowadays and get those out onto app stores, and those can be really good showpieces, not only when you apply to jobs, but also applying to graduate school. And I did that. I actually had an app or two on the App Store when I applied to graduate school, and I definitely mentioned that, and I hope it had some kind of impact because I felt pretty good about having that at that time. This was pretty early. This was like 2010 when the app stores were just a couple years old.
That's awesome.
So I think there are things you can do that are aside from formal education that can show that you have the skill set to succeed in graduate school. And I think that some of these opportunities are really great for self-starters, people who, if you have that passion, these opportunities, I don't think they really existed even like, let's say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that there wasn't a way to prove your skill set in the same way that there is today. So for the people who are motivated, I think there's all kinds of avenues.
Yeah, I was actually when I was scanning through your background, I saw that you created an app called Poems, and I was
Oh
thinking
yeah.
about your minor in English Lit and probably just your love of poetry and creative writing. And I love that you did that because it just shows your entrepreneurial spirit, also your passion for literature and poetry. And I think that kind of stuff, even if it doesn't make you any money, just shows like this person stands out because they're actually creating something and just trying something out. It shows a lot of initiative. And I know that a lot of companies are looking for that too. Like people that it really helps to build up a resume to show that they built something from scratch.
Yeah, that's actually a fun app. That's been out on the App Store for almost 10 years now, and it's not like a
Wow.
huge app with millions of users or something, but there must be more than 10,000 submitted poems by
Awesome.
now over the last 10 years, and it's just fun to read them sometimes. I mean, the submissions you get are really entertaining. Seeing how at one point a few years ago a community developed around the app where people were actually writing poems in response to one another on the
Oh,
app,
that's
and there was kind
cool.
of yeah, there was like a real thread going back and forth amongst many different users. And so some of doing these things can be a lot of fun too. So I think, I guess the lesson from that is that building your resume can be fun. It doesn't have to be just work.
I think it's so cool that you did that. It's very creative, and I love that it just kind of brings your passions together of technology and literature into this really cool app called Poems. And then having a community, like it's really hard to get a community started, especially in a very competitive place like the App Store. So props to you for doing that. Um, you, I think, just from looking at your background too, how early you started writing books. You wrote your first book on Dart,
Hmm.
and just your just so early on, like you have been very much committed to education, whether it's writing books or even teaching. And I'm wondering, like, where did that passion for helping others come from?
It's kind of a boring answer, but my dad was a computer science professor. And my grandma was a professor, and my aunt is a professor, and so it's kind of
Wow.
just it's in the family a little bit. So I wrote that first book, Dart for Absolute Beginners, in 2013 was when I did most of the writing, and it came out in 2014. And that was actually a low point in my life. I had two failed startups, one that I was a contributor to, and one that I was a co-founder of. And I was actually pretty ill at that time
Mm.
with a physical illness that like really took me back during that year. And I was like trying to start a consulting company, building some web apps and iOS apps for other people after doing these startups. And I was getting a couple clients from that and starting that up. But I also was finding myself pretty ill and with a lot of time on my hands. And so that's when I put the time into to write that book. But it's amazing how the book kind of led to everything else because I wrote that book and that book led me to getting the position as an adjunct instructor at a local college, community college. And then that led to the full-time position as an assistant professor up here in Vermont. So there was a definite like line that started to today and the newer books that I've done that started from writing that book at a real low point in my life. So I'm glad that even though it was a terrible time in my life, something really positive came out of it that led to everything today. So
What do you think kept you going? Because I mean, just launching a startup, the amount of work, the passion to do a startup, and then having to deal with all the humps in the road, and then the failures along the way. And then you describe that period as being like a low point, and then having another startup, and maybe that went through a failure too. What I'm very curious, like what kept you going during that period, and was there ever a thought of like I should just scrap the startup and just like go into the corporate world?
So at that point in 2013, I don't think getting a corporate job was really even an option. I
Okay,
was honestly I was too physically sick,
okay,
and I got it was just a crazy time in my life. I mean, I was basically bedbound at one point.
mm,
From I had a autoimmune reaction to a virus I got that destroyed the nerves, the autonomic nerves in the lower part of my body. And so I developed a condition called POTS, which is like where every time you stand up, your heart races because blood pools in the lower part of your
oh,
body. And so it makes you feel very, very ill all the time, and it's pretty bad. But luckily I recovered over the next few years, but next couple of years. But there was really not a lot of options. Like I could try to work from home, and work from home then wasn't what work from home is today. And so that's why I was trying to do the consulting, and I did eventually have success with that, going over the next couple of years, getting clients and building iOS apps. But when I was just starting out, I found myself, okay, all I can be basically is at home, and I need to do something productive with my time. And so I had already had the idea for the book back in 2012. And I was like, you know what?
mm.
I better go all out on this because I want to feel like that when 2013 is over, hopefully I'm starting to get better. But at the same time, hopefully I have something to show that I did this year, that this wasn't just a year of just being sick, but this was a year of producing something that was going to be useful to me, for my future. So I would say the book was the first book, not the current books, but the first book was really something almost like I had no choice but to do the book. Like, what
Mm.
else am I going to do that's useful this year? And starting a consulting company, the first year was rough. I got one or two clients. The next year, I started to get more, and then it started to build on itself. And 2014 was successful with it, and 2015 was more successful with it, and it started to really snowball after that. But that year, it was almost like I had no alternative but to do the book.
Mm.
For I know that sounds weird, like you have no choice but to write a book, but
Right,
it
right, right.
almost felt that way. There was like, what else was I going to do with my time that at that
Well,
point?
that's amazing because I'm like thinking like if I was really sick, like I might feel so defeated, like I'm just gonna kind of resign myself to just resting and trying to get better. And you were like, I want to do something with this time, even though I can't be working physically. I'm gonna put my brain to work and write a book. That's a lot of work to like write a book, especially when you're physically sick. How, like, what was that process like for you?
Well, it was a nice escape really from thinking about the problems, and it felt good. I mean, that was the best part of my day every day. I think was working on the book because it felt good to be doing something productive and doing something that I thought it was a good book, so it felt good to be doing something that I felt proud of at the end of the day. And I um I think I'm really lucky that I could do it. So there's some people who you get ill and there's really you don't have a skill set that translates to what can you do from being in bed, right?
Hmm.
But I think people who work in computing or writing for that matter are very lucky in that they can kind of do that job from anywhere. So yeah, it was a nice escape from the day-to-day problems of the illness, and it ultimately was something that came out even better than I could have hoped for, considering what it led to.
I think it's awesome that you did that, and I think it's very motivating just to hear your story. And I want to ask you about the transition from writing the book, showing your expertise, and explaining very hard concepts for beginners to help them in their process, and then moving into a teaching position. I have a lot of friends that actually really struggled when they first became professors because it's very hard to like take that academia and now actually talk about it and also kind of get over the nerves of being in front of a group of people. And I'm kind of curious about that journey for you as you move from um, writing an amazing book to help people to now teaching in a classroom. Can you talk a little bit about that journey for you as you begin to transition into being a professor?
Yeah, so I'm coming at it from a pretty different perspective than most professors because I'm coming at it from not a PhD research program perspective. And most people who teach at four-year colleges, in fact, I looked this up, I'm one of less than 1% of people who work at four-year colleges as a computer science assistant professor who don't have a PhD. So I'm
Oh,
part of like a
really?
very, yeah, I'm part of a
Wow.
very small percentage. And it just so happened that this school was looking for somebody to teach their mobile application development specialization. And I happen to have that skill set and the book background. So
Yeah.
I'd shown that, and the adjunct teaching, I'd shown that I was the right person for this very specific niche. And then since then,
Yeah.
I've started teaching more general computer science courses. But so I got very lucky. Again, I've been very lucky in my life in multiple different ways. But anyway, so I'm coming from a really different perspective than most people who work at four-year colleges as computer science professors. Most of them are coming out of a PhD program, and a PhD program is not a teaching degree. A PhD program is a research program, right? It's a research degree. It's showing that you can go into some very, very narrow aspect of computer science and make a meaningful contribution to that narrow aspect of computer science. That's the end product of a PhD. And so then it's not surprising, therefore, that when we're not training necessarily people to be teachers and then putting them into a classroom, that a lot of them struggle with it. And that maybe is a comment more on the way that we organize academia as a whole rather than my specific situation. But for me, because I built it up gradually, I started with the book, and then I did adjunct teaching. I was able to build my skill set before I was launched into the classroom, like a deer in headlights. It was more like a gradual kind of transition. And I think I think no matter who you are, the first year teaching is challenging. Starting my fifth year now doing it full time, and I'm still every day learning new ways to express myself in the classroom and new ways to connect with students and refining my approach every semester. And I think you have to have that passion though for connecting with the students. That I think that's kind of what's unfortunate sometimes is that people who really want to be researchers are almost like forced into the classroom a little bit. Maybe they didn't get a big enough grant, so they didn't get enough ability to teach less classes because the college says, okay, you're not getting enough grant money, so you're going to have to teach more classes. That happens pretty regularly. So I think it's better when you're coming from it from the perspective in the beginning, I want to teach, rather than the perspective of, well, I want to do research and teach. So maybe that's an argument for why it's good to go to a teaching college as an undergraduate rather than go to a research institution. But there's pros and cons both sides, because you also are then exposing yourself to the most cutting edge people in the field when you go to a research institution. So there's pros and cons. But I certainly was coming at it from a very different perspective, probably, than most people who work in four-year institutions as assistant professors of computer science.
I love the way that you explained, like, over the last 5 years of teaching, you've just been refining your process and learning how to be a better teacher, learning how to better express yourself and to teach certain concepts. What were some things that you've learned along the way to give advice for those who are just starting to teach computer science? Some things that you maybe didn't do in the beginning, but now you do it because you've learned that that was actually a great way of presenting concepts or connecting better with your students.
Well, I'd say the number one thing is to be interactive. When I was in college, and I had a very good experience in undergrad, but still a lot of teaching was this: the professor gets up in the front of the room, does a lecture, you take notes, and that's kind of the end, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's not, and that wasn't that long ago, right? I'm only
Right,
11
right,
years out of
totally.
undergrad, but that's still how it really was. But students today don't really want that. They want a two-way conversation. They want interactive segments. So instead of me going up and showing, okay, here's this code I wrote, I do that sometimes still, of course, but then it's also, there has to be an aspect where here's the code that they wrote, and here's me helping you step by step, sometimes even in class, going around the classroom from student to student, helping them as we're approaching the problem together as a class, putting them into small groups where they work together and then demonstrating that to the rest of the class, and me kind of guiding and showing where they did things great and where things could be a little bit better. So having a two-way conversation, having discussions, even in computer science classes, there's plenty of room to have discussions about different avenues of technical solutions, about ethics, about different stylistic choices. There's all kinds of places that, if you really think about it, you can have a discussion that people might not have, that maybe sometimes used to be more dry in the classroom. I think people today are finding ways to make more substantial and interactive. So that's my number one piece of advice and I think what I've learned over the last 5 years is that it's very important to have an interactive classroom, a hands-on classroom. People use buzzwords like active learning, but I think there's really some substance to that.
And how do you draw out, because sometimes your students might be very shy and you might have a class, like one year you might have a class order where everyone's like very active, enjoys the discussion, and the next quarter maybe half the class is just more shy, more reserved. How are you kind of drawing out maybe the quiet ones in the class?
Well, that's something I still struggle with. You have to be careful not to push too hard also, because when you push too hard, and I've made that mistake before, some students actually get offended that you're trying to, like, they feel like you're putting them on the spot, right? And so you have to be careful that there's a balance to be struck there where, look, if this person is doing great work and they basically know what they're doing, that you don't force them into situations that demotivate them because they feel like they're being singled out just because they're not as talkative as the other students. But one thing I've tried to do in one of my classes, I teach a class on open source software development. I just handed it off actually to somebody else this last year, but I taught it for 3 years, and I put the students actually in a circle, like in an English lit class. And I know you have an English background, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So right. So I took those classes too as a minor, and you'd basically talk about the book you read in a circle, and dive into some of the different lenses that you could see the literature through. So in the open source class, we did that to talk about ethics, history, development techniques in software. There are places for that. I mean, there are ways to take what you might expect in a liberal arts classroom and put that into a technical classroom if you find the right subject matter for it. Now, it doesn't work for everything. When you're teaching, about data structures and algorithms, that doesn't as much lend itself into a circle. But even in that class last year, we had a day talking about some of the ethics of modern algorithms, where we did actually sit in a circle and talk. So there's ways to have a discussion if you really are seeking it.
I love that. So I remember some of my toughest classes that I really struggled in. I spent more time with my professors or my teachers' aides in those classes, teaching assistants, because I really struggled. And I'm wondering if for those who may be struggling in their data science classes or computer science classes, advice you would give them as a teacher that they should be doing, because sometimes we're scared to talk to the teacher because we feel like, oh, we're not getting a good grade, or we're not interacting enough in class, and the professor doesn't like me. But really, like, those are the times to be meeting and talking directly with your teacher. So I wonder if you can kind of just share for those maybe who are struggling in a class, advice for them.
Well, you said it, and it's to go to office hours. So going into the office hours so that the instructor actually knows you, it doesn't mean you're going to get special attention in the sense that they're going to give you a better grade or something just because they know you. But they might send you that helpful email just when you needed it. They might send you just along the right direction, or allow you to redo some work or do some extra credit, because they understand your situation and they understand that you're really trying. But, I think all teachers really want to help students who are trying. And by going to office hours, you're showing that you're trying. When you're just a name in a long list of names, they might not even realize the type of oftentimes I think students think that we can read their minds and know the struggles they're going through, but we don't. And you don't have to go and get personal with us. You don't have to tell us all the details of what's going on with you. but even just to have that contact saying, here's the topic that I'm really having struggles with. And the instructor can go and say, okay, here's what I really think you need to do, very precisely knowing how you've done so far in the class to get better at that topic, is kind of what you're paying for in face-to-face education, right? Otherwise, we might as well all just go to the library, right? Getting that guidance from the instructor is one of the main things that you're paying for when you go to a four-year college in person. And so I think that far too many students, unfortunately, take advantage of that. It's ironically, the students you see the most in office hours are the great students. You see the students who are doing fantastic and have great grades. They're the ones who come in all the time. And maybe that's part of the reason they're doing so well is because they're so dedicated. But there are students who are really dedicated and, like you said, are just too shy. And we're always trying to find ways to convince them to come into office hours. Sometimes we try to make it more fun. Like one thing we've been doing the last few years is starting to have social events with the department. So nothing too crazy, but just having a bake-off. I've been organizing that the last year. So each of the faculty members bake something and the students come and vote on who baked the best thing. Or having a movie night where we watch a movie about computing and then we talk about it after. Just doing these simple things makes the students more comfortable approaching you. And then they're more likely to, we hope, come into office hours after that and when they actually need help. So getting a little bit more, I don't want to use the word personal because it's not like, it's not that we're getting personal. It's more approachable, showing yourself as a faculty member to be approachable. I think one thing that's helped me is that I am a very young faculty member. So I started adjunct teaching when I was 27. I'm 33 now. So maybe they feel like they can still relate to me a little bit more than somebody who's older. So that's definitely been an advantage for me, maybe, is that, I look and feel more approachable to them, even as subjective and shallow as that is. But I think having those points of contact with students outside of the classroom just increases their ability to feel like they can come to you for help.
Being so young as a professor, has that helped you? Has it hurt you in any way?
I think, it's happened to me many times, even though I'm not that young that like you would think this would happen, but I get confused for a student all the time. Like
David, you look very young.
Well, I guess, thank you. I guess better than the alternative, I guess. I don't know. But it happens to me all the time. In fact, when I just started here, back in 2016, I started here. I was at a reception for new students, like with their families, right?
Yeah.
And the president of the college was walking around from table to table, and he comes up to me and he's like, "Thank you. And what's your name? And are these your parents?" And he pointed to like my colleagues. And ironically, he was part of the interview process. He had just interviewed me like 6 months before. I guess you remember me, whatever. But it was, it was a little embarrassing. But so amongst other fellow faculty, it's probably a disadvantage to be young because, maybe your voice is not as wanted to be heard, which, by the way, I think when you are somebody new to an organization, it's more important to listen than it is to be heard anyway. So I hope I've spent most of the last 4 years here at Champlain listening more than talking. But that said, with the students, I actually think it's an advantage because they feel like they can relate to me more. I don't think there's ever been a respect issue there. I don't think there's ever been an issue where the students feel like because I'm on the younger side, they don't respect what I'm saying in the classroom. I think you earn your respect, right? It doesn't just come from what you look like or how old you are. I think it comes from how well you convey the ideas in the classroom, how well you present them, how well you structure the class. I think you set the tone the first couple weeks in the class. If you take the students seriously, I think they take you seriously. And if you show that you've really put the time in to make this a great experience for them, I think the respect will naturally come out of that. And so then being young actually then, because I'm more approachable, has been a net benefit with the students for sure, I think.
How have you dealt with, because sometimes students can be distracted and you can set rules in the classroom, like, don't have any devices out. You can do certain things like that. But sometimes there are going to be students who maybe seem like they don't care. Maybe they're looking off, kind of doing their own thing. And that can be very distracting when you're trying to teach a class. Like just having even one person roll their eyes, like you're going to see it, right? And it can kind of stop you for a minute. I'm kind of curious, like how you've dealt with things like that, because that comes up for teachers.
Mike, you're absolutely right. And actually, where I went to undergrad back then, they already were implementing rules of no like laptops in the classroom, that sort of thing in certain classes so that students wouldn't be distracted. I haven't gone that far. And one of the difficulties is that we teach a lot of our classes in computer labs. So the students all have a computer in front of them no matter what. And that's to our benefit too, because then when they do that interactive programming, they always all have the same environment. And when we're going around helping them, we know what to expect when we see the screen. But it's a real problem. I think it's a really big problem for this particular generation, the people, again, who are just not that much younger than me, but who grew up already with iPhones and with Android devices. And I think there really is a shortened attention span as a result of that. I think the people have probably always been saying that. People have been saying when television came out, people have a shorter attention span. And when video games came out, people have a shorter attention span. But I mean, I certainly notice it. I certainly think that that students have a shorter attention span than just a decade ago when I was in school. That said, how do you combat it? I think, unfortunately, you have to, it's more about you having to hold their attention than any policy that you put in place. No matter what policy, first of all, if you put a policy in place that's too draconian, the students are going to resent it. And I've seen that happen to some other instructors where they put in like no cell phones allowed in the classroom and no laptops. And then I think the students end up really resenting that. And then you also have to think about, for accessibility purposes, there's some students who the way they take notes is on the laptop, right? And
that's right.
They can't really take handwritten notes for various reasons. And then you're singling them out, basically, the students who can't take handwritten notes, and you're saying, okay, we're going to make an exception for you because
right.
Everyone knows that they're an exception. So I'm not into like the draconian rules, but you really have to keep them engaged. Like we were talking about earlier about making the classes interactive. I hate to say this, but I do think if you are doing just a pure lecture, which you do have to do sometimes, not everything can be interactive. Unfortunately, I think unfortunately or fortunately, depending on if you enjoy doing this kind of thing, there has to be a little bit of an entertainment aspect to it too, because you have to hold their attention, and people do have shorter attention spans. And so you need to make sure that the whole time that you're talking, they're excited about the next thing you're going to say. And so I don't want to say that education just becomes entertainment. Absolutely not. But that doesn't mean that you can just stand up there and I think we've all had that professor in undergrad who read out of the textbook or something like that. Like you can't do that. That's awful. And so there's a balance to be struck there, but there has to be some level of showmanship and excitement to present the ideas that then excites the students, I think.
And you have to be like super creative to be able to take sometimes very complex topics or computer science topics and actually make it entertaining and interesting. So how are you like kind of approaching like very complex topics and going, okay, how am I going to make this particular thing interesting and exciting? Because this could definitely go into the snore category where people are going to want to fall asleep.
Yeah, I'm lucky that I get to teach classes, a lot of them that are pretty interesting. So I teach like iOS development, Android development. These are fun classes compared to some of the other classes that the students take. But when I teach a class like this semester, I'm teaching data structures and algorithms, and I taught that last year too. There are some subjects in that are just naturally complex. And like you said, they can be a little bit of a snooze fest and a little bit boring. Unfortunately, you can only like jazz them up so much. I think it's more important to express them clearly. I want to temper what I said before. It's more important to be clear than it is to be entertaining. But that said, as long as you're couching them in between subjects that are more entertaining, you can hopefully hold their attention. But I wish that we could make everything fun, but there's some topics that when you're getting into some sophisticated math, or you're getting into something that has a lot of theory, that you have to kind of slog through. But I think, again, if you can stop, which I do a lot, and then have the conversation again, have a discussion, a two-way discussion in the middle of it, then that's making the students feel like they're participating in their own education instead of just being told down, well, here's the great theory. You're saying, okay, here's the theory. Now, what do you think about how this theory can be applied to so-and-so? And then you hear back from them their ideas about that. So one thing I'm always doing is I'm stopping. Like I'm talking for, if I am doing more of a lecture type of class, I'm talking for 5 to 10 minutes. Then I'm stopping and they're doing some thinking and they're doing some talking back at me. And I think that using the Socratic method, which is the oldest way of teaching pretty much, is still super relevant. And I think it really belongs in a technical classroom, maybe even as much as in a liberal arts classroom, because today, when students are dealing with some of these topics, there are so many societal issues that they also need to be thinking, like a data structures and algorithms class. I mean, you think about what's been going on with Facebook, you think about what's been going on with some of the controversies around AI the last few years. Students really need to be thinking through those topics when they're first learning them, I think, because that actually, believe it or not, that actually excites a lot of them. Thinking about the societal impacts of this theory that they're learning makes many of them more motivated to actually learn it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I love that you're making space for that because those are like totally relevant. It's timely. And that definitely will make something come alive because now they see that this isn't just theory or a math to learn. It's something that is like relevant to what's happening now. And you want to hear their voices, their opinions. It's going to impact like the work that they choose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, you know what? So we've been talking about like you like teaching in the classroom. I personally like love, that's what I loved about college is just like being in a classroom, being in an environment where I'm surrounded by other students with a professor. And I just love being around people too. I'm very like extroverted. Right now during COVID, a lot of classes have been like moved to online and professors had to pivot to like all of a sudden from being in a classroom with maybe a whiteboard, all of a sudden now I'm on a screen with 30, 40 other people. And it can feel more like hosting a podcast, a one-way thing. It can be very, very hard to like get other people to chime in. I'm kind of curious, like, how have you been navigating this period? And maybe some advice for those who are just transitioning into moving fully as a teacher online right now.
Yeah. So when I first started this online journey with everyone else in March, I actually made a mistake, which was that there's been a lot of talk about flipped classrooms the last few years and for a while now, really. And the idea of a flipped classroom is that you kind of record the lecture ahead of time, the students watch it. And then when they come into the classroom, you then have interactive aspects where they work on problems from what they learned outside the classroom so that and which is kind of what I've been doing all the time, except for that was one of my 2 days each week. So I usually have 2 classes a week of each class. And the first class is a lecture. And the second class is what we've been talking about, this more interactive where they're writing code and I'm going around helping them and they're working as groups and that sort of thing. And the mistake I made when COVID started was when I went to the online format, I made the lectures asynchronous, but I didn't have enough of what we've been talking about, which is that interactive synchronous part. And so for this fall, my plan and and I've also been learning a lot from my colleagues, what worked for them in the spring is I'm going fully synchronous. So meaning that I'm not going to record myself ahead of time and have the students watch it. I'll still record the sessions for students who might have a bad internet connection or whatever. But I'm planning on all the students attending as much as they can the set time periods when the class is supposed to be and having as much interaction with them live as I can instead of just part of it being live and a lot of it being pre-recorded. I think I lost some students by going to that kind of asynchronous, I'm going to record these parts ahead of time, you watch them, and then maybe we'll talk about it a little bit after. So I'm trying to go fully synchronous, actually, with recordings for students who have that kind of issues. Our school is doing a hybrid approach where some of us will be teaching in person and some of us will be teaching online, and every faculty member and every student gets to make the choice for themselves whether or not they want to be in person or online. I volunteered to be in person. I won't lie and say that I haven't had second thoughts about that as things have evolved. But right now I'm still planning to be in person. And what I'm going to be doing is have the online students, because still, actually in one of my classes, 2/3 of the students have decided to be online, synchronous with me in the classroom. So the camera
Mm.
will be there. There'll be a document camera. The everything will be hopefully as good as it would be if I was just doing online. But I still will be in the classroom for the students who are there. Now, I'm sure there'll be some technical difficulties, or there'll be sometimes difficulties navigating between the students in person and the students online. And I think that's something I really need to be cognizant of, that if this is really not working after the first couple of weeks, maybe it makes sense to just go fully online and give at least everyone the same experience, as good of the same experience as possible, rather than giving the students in person maybe a better experience than the students online, or vice versa. So I need to carefully think about that as things change. But right now, the plan is to give the online students and the in-person students the same experience at the same time, and we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean it's big. It's a big experiment. Like everyone's trying to figure out like what's going to work for their classroom. Like right now, both my kids, my daughter is in high school, my son's in sixth grade, and so I feel so bad for the teachers because they're like, not only am I going to teach, and for sixth grade they're teaching all day, and if you're not on camera, the kids aren't on camera, they're absent, right?
I see.
So everyone has to be on camera the entire time, and I feel bad for the teachers because like they're also like tech support. Like they're basically trying to like help 30 kids. Like, is it their camera that's not working, or is it the audio is not working, and the teachers like trying to figure out and solve for all these different kids. So I feel bad, really bad for the teachers struggling with just the tech side. But right now, the way that they're doing it at the elementary school and even high school is just you're streaming too, and so me, like I'm talking to my coworkers, like everyone feels exhausted after being on a video call for over an hour because there's
Yeah.
that Zoom fatigue.
Hmm.
And these kids right now are kind of like this next generation coming up. They're getting used to like I'm on camera 5 hours of my day, like with
Yeah.
different teachers. And I'm like, wow, they're just kind of like getting used to being on camera. And the teacher will call on them. They have to like make sure their mic is on so they can respond right away. But it's a fascinating period.
Now, Mike, do the kids actually like seeing the teacher, or are they kind of like, you know what, I wish that I didn't have any school today at all? So are they excited for the Zoom calls ever, or are they always like, you know what, this is just painful?
I think actually my daughter's into it, and my son's definitely more like he's more extroverted, so he prefers like he's really sad being home. Like he's like, oh, I wish I was at school with my friends. Like he really is missing that component. So he's like he just wants to be in school. Um, so that part of it's hard for him. But as far as for him being online doing video stuff, he's okay. He's pretty cool with it. But it's like it comes down to privilege too. Like, does the school district have devices to hand out to all the kids?
Yep.
Do people have Wi-Fi? Like, it comes down to privilege to be able to even have devices to do online schooling. Like, all of that has to be working. And then, like, are they in a space where they can actually focus? Because you might be in a home where you have three kids and parents working from home, four different devices are all streaming, right? And that cuts into your bandwidth. So that's the technology side is also super hard. But yeah, like the struggles, like how are we going to like provide good teaching experiences in the midst of some people can't be in because it's not safe for them to be inside the classroom. It's really, really hard, but it's really cool to hear how you're kind of experimenting with this hybrid model of like, okay, I'm going to try being in the classroom for those that can be, and for those that can't, they are going to be online. We're going to try to make sure that it's a similar experience. But yeah, it's so hard.
Well, a lot of people have now decades of experience with online education, but the way that I think we think about online education is different from what people who were teaching in person are now trying to do online. And what do I mean by that? I mean that online education, at least as I've seen it at various institutions, has been more of this asynchronous model that I was talking about before, where you on your own time read this, watch this lecture, and then you do your work also on your own time. But I think for those of us who teach in person, usually what we're trying to provide now, and what I didn't do a good job maybe as well in the spring of doing, is this, okay, you're still going to have this live time with me. You're still going to, whether it's on camera or in person, it's still time where I'm there 100% dedicated to answering your questions and spending this next hour and a half with you. rather than this is your own time, and then maybe email me a question or something, or see me during office hours on a video chat. So that again, I guess it comes back again to what I really need to work on this fall is making sure that I'm providing interactivity with the students, because I think that's what they expect out of what's usually an in-person experience that they don't get from just a purely traditional online program.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you're experimenting with it and trying to build engagement during this time. And I also think there's something to like kind of the synchronous, like live presentation. There's something about watching something live with others where you feel more engaged because it's happening right there versus a recording where maybe it's just on in the background and you're kind of doing something else, but you're kind of listening. I feel like when it's live, it's something more immediate and it feels like, oh, I'm more engaged because this is happening right now. And actually, because it's live, something could happen that I'm not even expecting because it's not been polished. It's raw. It's just recording right now.
Yeah, I feel like you feel more a part of it, and
Yeah,
therefore you feel like you might need to contribute through your thinking as a part
that's
of it.
right.
Like, I better stay sharp because you know what? I might actually be the one who asks a question that steers this discussion, or I might actually be called on to do something. And so you feel more of a responsibility to the rest of the classroom and to yourself to be fully at attention, I guess, the whole time, rather than when you're just watching it, you can kind of drift off, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, we're still, I think all of us who are making this transition right now are still learning how to do it properly, and it's going to be a challenge for sure this semester. There are people who have been teaching through video conference for many years, and they're at a huge advantage right now. And we are getting a lot of education from our institutions. Like, my institution has a lot of seminars on how to present material effectively online and how to use certain online tools to keep the students engaged. And so it's not like we're out there by ourselves. Like, we're definitely
Hmm.
getting a lot of support. I feel the most actually for some of the more liberal arts type professors who are used to those discussion classes, which even more are hurt by being on video instead of in person. And also might not have learned these tools over the years, and we were already using, learning management systems. We were already using tools like GitHub to coordinate student work. We
Oh,
were
that's
already
awesome.
using a lot of online tooling even when we were in person. But for professors coming out of like English or something like that, right? I think this is more of a challenge for them because they're not only learning these tools for the first time, but then they're also having to adapt classes that are even more interactive than our classes are. So I feel for them the most.
Well, I mean, I just props to you for, experimenting, trying things out, trying your best to build engagement with your classroom during this very, very difficult time. I know every professor is trying to figure this out. I think it's cool the way you're experimenting and trying to get better and looking for feedback and 'cause it is a very difficult time. And I know that we're almost up on our hour, so I want to make sure that we do talk about your latest book on Python. Can you talk a little bit about your latest book with our audience?
Sure, yeah. So my last book that came out is called Classic Computer Science Problems in Python. And it's part of a series, the Classic Computer Science Problems series, that started in 2018 with Classic Computer Science Problems in Swift. And what we've been doing is we've been porting the book to different programming languages to bring it to new communities. So we started with the Swift book, and the Swift book, it was mildly successful. We came out with the Python book last year, and it's just been a runaway success. It's
Awesome.
sold many copies, and it's been translated into 8 different human languages. It's just been
Wow.
a really
Congratulations.
fantastic success for me and for the publisher. And it basically, what it does is it conveys computer science ideas in a tutorial-like code-centric fashion. So we have a chapter, for example, on neural networks, where you build a neural network from scratch using no external libraries, using as little theory as we can. Of course, we have to have enough theory that you can actually build it. And we show you step by step how absolutely from scratch you can build up a simple neural network. But we have chapters like that on clustering. We have chapters like that on search algorithms, on graph algorithms. It's a really broad survey of a lot of different computer science topics. And it's aimed at really three different audiences. One is self-taught programmers, so programmers who don't have a formal computer science education, but who want to know at least the beginning of these computer science topics. It's not an in-depth book. It's not like a textbook. It's not going to give you every piece of knowledge to be an expert in any of these domains. It's just going to give you enough of a taste so that you know what other people are talking about and you know how these libraries work behind the scenes by building up a simple version of them yourself. So that's one of the big audiences. Another audience is, of course, people who are in computer science programs who just want maybe a friendlier introduction to some of these topics. And then the last audience is actually longtime software developers who are refreshing on these topics for interviews. So, a lot of interviews today are very algorithmic. You go up on a whiteboard. This book is a good refresher for people getting ready for those interviews. And so now we're coming out with another one, Classic Computer Science Problems in Java. And what we found with the Swift book is that even though the book got great reviews and it was, I think a great book, it was too small of a language audience for this niche of a topic. So, we sold a couple thousand copies, but then we went to Python and it just exploded. And so we want to bring it to another really big language audience. So bringing it to Java, we're pretty excited about.
That's awesome.
And so I don't know, in the future, we might keep bringing it to more languages. I've kind of used up all the languages now that I have a lot of professional and teaching experience in, now that I've done Swift, Python, and Java. So maybe somebody else will need to be my co-author on the one after the Java book. But yeah, we're really having a great run with these first few books in the series. And I think that if people are in one of those three categories and they feel like they want a gentler introduction before they dive into one of these big textbooks, and the classic textbooks in this space are Introduction to Algorithms by CLRS or Algorithms by Sedgwick and Wayne. Those are really like the two big classic textbooks that are in most college classrooms. Those can be a little intimidating. They're like, they're like a 700-page, reference level material, math heavy introductions. And this book tries to be as gentle and code centric. And I'm not going to say we don't have theory in it. Of course, we have to have theory to teach these topics, but we try to keep it as approachable as possible. And we've seen that that's what people have really appreciated about them. They felt like, okay, you didn't tell me every detail, but you told me enough to see if I'm interested in this topic and want to learn more. And then if they want to learn more, they can go to the textbooks.
Do you think you'll ever do like a video like series through this, like a Coursera, like taking people through your book in a video means?
So they've asked me to do that. The publisher asked me to do that after the Swift book. So I think this was 2 years ago. And I had my difficulty with doing. I did a video series many years ago. I have kind of a bad taste in my mouth with video series because I did a video series for the Dart book years ago, and then Apress had a change of management, and they never released the video series after I'd already recorded it. They never told me like it was low quality. I don't know. I have no idea what the decision was, why the decision was made that it wasn't released. But I put in like 100 hours making this video series, and then it never got released.
No.
So I just personally have a slightly bad taste for that. And I am thinking though that I want to do some of this for free on my own. Like I just recently recorded, based on a chapter in the book, like an hour-long video that I put on YouTube about search algorithms. So I'm thinking maybe that's what I'll do is I'll do kind of as I feel up to it, record some piecemeal videos on different topics. But I don't think right now I have the stamina to do the whole book as a series, because it's actually, the book is really wide-ranging. I mean, chapter 1 is a gentle introduction, but then chapter 2 is search algorithms. Chapter 3 is constraint satisfaction problems. Chapter 4 is graph algorithms. Chapter 5 is k-means clustering. Chapter 5 is genetic algorithms. Chapter 6 is k-means clustering. Chapter 7 is neural networks. Chapter 8 is adversarial search, like how do you do tic-tac-toe or chess or checkers. And then chapter 9 is like miscellaneous problems that didn't fit anywhere else. But it's so wide-ranging. There's so many topics. And to do those topics justice in video format would be as much work as writing the books has been.
Oh, geez.
So, I don't think that I have the stamina to do it right now after 3 books in 3 years, but who knows what the future might bring.
Yeah. Well, I feel like maybe down the line having some sort of like teaser videos, like, oh, here's a little like 4-minute video on this particular aspect covered in the chapter. Hey, to learn more, check out the book. What a bummer that you did so much work, 100 hours of video, and it never got released. That's just gotta like, I can see why.
You know what? I'm particularly unhappy about it because, obviously because I did all that work. Now they did, to be fair to them, they did pay me the advance, even though I did the work, but the advance versus hopefully how much we would actually sell later on is not very much. But what kind of irks me about it is that, then they retain the rights to it because they paid me the advance. So they have the rights to those videos. So I couldn't go then just release them on my own.
Right.
And, I'm actually battling that publisher right now because I want the rights back to my first book.
Yeah, totally.
Because my first book, what happened is it got really out of date. So I wrote it in 2013. It came out in 2014. And that language, Dart, has evolved a great deal from 2014. And when it first came out, the book got really great reviews. And now it gets terrible reviews, rightly so, because it's really outdated and the language has evolved. And even some of the tools we mentioned in the book don't exist anymore. So I want the rights back. And it sells like a few copies a year. And because it's so outdated. And it's just accumulating bad reviews for me and the publisher. And the publisher won't give me back the rights. So we're kind of, I might have
you're
to
stuck. Yeah, you're like stuck right now. Yeah. Before we go, I also want to quickly talk about your podcast because when I was researching, I found the Kopec Explains Software podcast that you have. Can you share about that?
Yeah, sure. So that's a podcast I just started recently. It's my 3rd podcast. I did a podcast from 2015 to 2017 about the world of kind of app development consulting. So like building iOS apps for other people, as I was doing back then. Then when I started working as a professor, that podcast didn't make sense that much anymore because I wasn't in that world anymore. And I've been doing a podcast with a couple of my friends called Business Books and Company. Each month we read some business book and then we talk about it. I'm more like the moderator because I'm not coming from the business side as much. And then just recently I started this podcast, Kopec Explains Software, actually with my wife. So my wife like asked me the questions.
How cool is that?
And I kind of go back and answer, and not to like say that I'm explaining it to her. She's just the starting off point for the audience.
Right.
But we have a lot of fun doing it together, and we're just growing. So we just started 2 months ago, but we're already getting some good feedback about it, and I'm hoping to again just use whatever tools I've learned in the classroom to take complex ideas and make them a little bit more expressible in the podcast as well. So our audience here is not actually computer science people. Our audience is like regular people who want to know more about how software works.
And I love that you brought your wife in for that. Like, that's so cool. Husband and wife duo doing the podcast. And I'm gonna make sure to promote it on our Experian Data Lab Twitter account and on the blog. I'll be linking out to it. So everyone check out Kopec Explains Software podcast. Awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for being on Data Talk and sharing your time with us, talking about your latest book. And I want to thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It was really an honor. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Data Talk podcast. We share new shows every week, and you can find the full catalog of previous episodes, including YouTube videos, on our Experian news blog. You can get access to the full catalog by going to experian.com/datatalk. And we always love hearing from our community, so if you have any comments or suggestions for future shows or guests you'd like to hear from, please let us know. You can leave a comment on iTunes, or you can reach out to us on Twitter @Experian Data Lab. You can also email me directly. My email is michael.delgado@experian.com. Take care, and we'll chat next week.